Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
President Trump heads for Des Moines as his border czar lands in Minneapolis. Welcome to the Tuesday edition as the president tries to steer the narrative to the issue of affordability, even as he orders a changing of the guard in Minneapolis. We're going to go to ground and get the latest on meetings that Tom Homan is holding in the city with Bloomberg's immigration reporter Alicia Caldwell, who is there right now. We'll talk with Tyler Kendall about the president's speech later today in Iowa, and we'll get insights on it all from Mick Mulvaney, the president's former acting chief of staff from the first term, back with us today on Bloomberg. We'll have analysis from our political panel with Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis. Welcome to the Tuesday edition on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, where we just said goodbye to President Trump. He's on his way to Iowa right now, a speech in Des Moines, back on the affordability tour, set to coincide with the closing bell about 4 p.m. Eastern time. We'll see how close to on time he is, and we plan to bring you some of his remarks live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Having just now been asked in the White House driveway on his way to Marine One about the situation in Minneapolis and the investigation into Alex Preddy's death, he said, quote, "We're doing a big investigation. I want to see the investigation. I'm going to be watching over it. I want a very honorable and honest investigation." He said, "I have to see it myself." These could be some of the most complete remarks we hear from the president today, as again, he tries to steer the narrative toward affordability, knowing that big changes are coming now in Minneapolis. It was around this time yesterday the president announced on Truth Social that he'd had a phone call with Tim Walz, the governor, suggesting that they were on a similar wavelength. Those are the words that he used. A bit later on today, he said he had a very good telephone conversation with Mayor Jacob Fry of Minneapolis. A lot of progress being made. Tom Homan, he says, will be meeting with him tomorrow, and we're waiting for word on that. Homan has already met with the governor, knowing that Greg Bovino has been dispatched back to California, and that we've been seeing a bit of a sidelining of the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristine Noem. All of these gears turning as Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, spoke to reporters yesterday about how to regain control over the situation. Listen.
He has outlined a clear and simple path to restoring law and order in Minnesota. Number one, Governor Walz, Mayor Fry, and all Democrat leaders should turn over all criminal illegal aliens currently incarcerated in their prisons and jails to federal authorities, along with any illegal aliens with active warrants or known criminal histories for immediate deportation. Number two, state and local law enforcement must agree to turn over all illegal aliens who are arrested by local police. And then thirdly, local police must assist federal law enforcement in apprehending and detaining illegal aliens who are wanted for crimes, especially violent crimes.
That path laid out this time yesterday at the White House, even as the investigations continue. We go to ground in Minneapolis with Alicia Caldwell. Bloomberg News immigration reporter has made her way to the city as all of these developments take place. Alicia, it's great to have you with us. I know it's bitter cold in Minneapolis, and we appreciate your stopping down during your day of reporting here. How are these ideas being put forth by the White House going over with local officials, whether it's the mayor or, for that matter, the governor?
You know, for the moment, the response is a little bit unclear from the ground. Historically, the answer has been largely no, that local police don't have a role in enforcing federal immigration law. It's a civil procedure as a general proposition. The state prison system does cooperate, and they do coordinate. In fact, they've posted a separate page now of information that they say rebuts many of the claims from the administration about cooperation, be it people who were arrested from their facilities or turned over. And, you know, ICE also has to proceed and take those people into custody when the state says, hey, we're about to release this person. And so there's a conflict there. But in terms of local police, you know, they don't have very many officers relative. They have about 600 officers. There's 3,000 federal agents here right now, or at the peak there was. And the Minneapolis Police Department is shorthanded. They're down by about a third, according to the police chief. So, you know, that's a big ask that doesn't seem to be readily in the making.
Can you tell any difference on the ground today, Alicia, with Bovino out? He apparently was taking some officers with him. Is there a different posture in Minneapolis today?
It's hard to know. There's as many agents as there are and have been in the region. Sometimes it's a bit of a needle in a haystack. So what you're seeing is a lot of people in their neighborhoods who see things and then report things and post to social media. But what I'm hearing from local residents is a sense of relief, but tempered with wait and see approaches. As I overheard one person describe, they can't wait to dance in the street when everything is official and over. But for now, things are still really tense. I've been here off and on for the last 3 weeks, back again first thing this morning. The city is still tense. As you drive around, you'll see people with whistles, people on street corners with brightly colored vests, operating as community lookouts effectively and trying to help, as they describe, trying to help their neighbors stay safe.
Well, it's really important that you're there, Alicia Caldwell. We do appreciate your reporting. You cannot do this kind of reporting without actually being there. And we'll stay close to Alicia on this. Ahead of our conversation with Mick Mulvaney, I want to bring in Tyler Kendall. Thank you so much, Alicia, for her take on the president's speech today. There are two prongs to this story. You've got what's happening in Minneapolis, and you've got the messaging that's going to come from the president. Having heard from him in the driveway, Tyler, a short time ago, he says Kristi Noem is not out. He's going to be tracking this investigation. And by the time 4 o'clock Eastern rolls around, he's going to want us to be talking about strides this administration is taking when it comes to affordability. What do we expect from him in Des Moines?
Well, Joe, this bid at de-escalation from the Trump administration has largely been overshadowed because, or rather, the White House's apparent want to focus on affordability has been overshadowed. And that is why we're seeing this perhaps bid at a de-escalation, as we were just hearing Tom Homan now being sent over there. But it's really continuing what feels like a theme over the past few weeks, right? We had President Trump's speech in Davos last week, which we were told was going to be about affordability. And then it ended up being overshadowed by Greenland. So we'll see if this could be perhaps a reset for President Trump as he heads to Iowa. It's been pointed out that this is going to be a relatively friendly crowd, right? President Trump has won Iowa repeatedly. You and I were there during the Iowa caucuses when it was just about as cold as it is now, and he handedly won that race. But he's also dealing with a few different factors, including that Iowa has had a mixed response when it comes to his policies, such as trade tensions with China. Iowa is the second top producers of soybeans in this country. Today, we saw U.S. consumer confidence plummet to its lowest level since 2014. And then hanging over all of this is the potential that we could have a partial government shutdown over what is happening when it comes to ICE in Minneapolis.
Well, we'll see what the rhetoric includes. As I mentioned, that speech set for 4 p.m. Eastern. We're going to carry it here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Incidentally, 16 degrees right now in Des Moines. If that's bringing back some memories, I think we were sub-zero, which they have been in Minneapolis as well. Tyler, thank you so much. Right now in Minneapolis on the ground, 5 degrees. Which is a warm-up from where we were over the weekend when thousands of protesters were on the streets. Pretty remarkable to consider. And I'd love to know what Mick Mulvaney has in his mind today as the president gears up for another rally, in this case in Iowa, a very important state on the map, but it's also a very confusing news cycle right now. The former Republican congressman, former acting chief of staff of the White House in the first term, former director of the Office of Management and Budget. I could keep going. It's a long business card, and it's been a long time since we've had you on, Mick. It's good to have you back. I hope the year is starting out well for you. We talk a lot about resets in Washington and with this administration. Is this another one today?
It is, and it's the likes of which I've not seen before. I was talking to Sean Spicer, a friend of mine from the first administration this morning. We both agreed we've not seen a pivot this significant, this quickly from Donald Trump ever. Wow. You've talked about a couple of things about Kristi Noem sort of being moved aside, maybe temporarily, for Tom Homan, who will be answering directly to the president. The president was straight about that. Bavino getting shipped off to California. The president talking to both the governor and the mayor, which doesn't seem remarkable, except that J.D. Vance was there over the weekend and did not meet with those folks or did not talk to them. The language coming out of the White House now from Caroline Leavitt is very different than the language that was coming out of DHS. So it's almost an all-of-administration pivot. And I think rightly so. They were getting their teeth kicked in on this politically. It was, anytime Americans see a citizen on his knees getting shot in the back by federal law enforcement officers, that's a really bad day for the White House. So I've never seen anything like it, but I think it's the right response.
Wow, Mick. Well, that's something else. What did you make of the president's response just now in the driveway? Will Kristine Noem step down was the question, not will you fire her. He said no. If you're a cabinet secretary on the rocks like this, how do you interpret an answer like that?
Well, you do it the right way, and I think Christie would do it the right way. You ask the boss, look, do you need me to step down? And if he says, yeah, the president shouldn't ever have to fire any member of the cabinet. Okay, what the president would do is, make it clear that we want you to go, and you would offer your resignation. And I just can't see that happening. Look, DHS has had a disastrous couple of weeks on messaging. They just have. A lot of this turmoil right now is caused by the immediate reaction that DHS had to both the killing over the weekend, but also 10 days ago with Renee Good, when they essentially ran to the microphones and said, oh, these were domestic terrorists or these were assassins. That's what's causing a lot of this. It's just that tin-eared response. I don't know if you end up sacking your cabinet secretaries over messaging difficulties. Kristine Noem has done exactly what the administration has wanted since she took over. I cannot imagine them firing her over this. If she offered her resignation, the president said, no, that sounds like it's probably the appropriate way for it to go.
So 2 hours in the Oval. Kristine Noem, Corey Lewandowski, according to the New York Times. Susie Wiles is in there. Caroline Leavitt. Strangely, Stephen Miller is not. Maybe not strangely. I'm just wondering, as somebody who's been in the room with Donald Trump when he's been angry, when he's been happy, what was the fly on the wall view of a meeting like this, knowing that Noem asked for it?
Well, I'm sorry. You did know. Sorry, you might have a piece of information I don't, because that's what I've been asking. Is who called for the meeting? Do you have information?
She requested the meeting. According to the New York Times, it was her request.
All right, so let's assume for sake of this discussion, the New York Times is right. I think it's fascinating to me that she asks for the meeting and Stephen Miller is not there. To have an immigration meeting in the Oval Office without Stephen Miller is, I don't know, it's like you and me having a market update, not talking about the Dow. You don't do that. So I think it'd be very interesting to confirm that she asked for the meeting, and then somebody must have affirmatively excluded Stephen. And there's only about two people who I know can do that. One is the President of the United States. The other is Susie Wiles, the Chief of Staff. So you telling me that she asked for the meeting reaffirms my position that I don't think she's leaving anytime soon.
Okay. Is this a tough time to be named Corey Lewandowski when you're not actually in the cabinet?
No, Corey's got a good relationship with the president going back. People who underestimate Corey Lewandowski's ability to work with President Trump do so at their own peril. I know Corey gets a lot of rap in the press, but he and the president are very close, have been for a long time. And look, is the president capable at some point of cutting ties with Corey Lewandowski? Yes. But I think it will be a much colder day in a much hotter place than what you guys are experiencing in Iowa and Minneapolis today.
I got you. Mick Mulvaney, boy, this is fascinating to hear your reaction to all of this. So let's fast forward 3-4 hours to the speech in Des Moines. What will be the president's posture? And is this going to be the same message that we heard in Detroit and in Pennsylvania?
I hope if it is, it should be the same topic, which is the economy. I hope it's a more focused meeting than speech than it was in Detroit. I don't think that speech went over very well, but of course that was a different audience. It is completely within what conversations would I have been having with the president the last 24 hours? Mr. President, we're losing on immigration. I can't believe I'm saying that because it's an 85% issue for us, but we are getting killed on immigration. Wow. Let's go talk about the economy, please. We can get people back on our side on immigration, but let's let things calm down and go back to affordability, back to the economy. We've got some decent policies. Let's go talk about them, and let's get back talking about what the voters want us to talk about, which is stuff that impacts them directly. So my guess is, and it's an educated guess, you will see a focus on the economy today, as you should see from the president. And hopefully they'll let this, they'll find a way to simmer things down in Minneapolis and across the country on immigration so they can reclaim the high ground on that at a later date before the midterms.
Really interesting, Mick. Would you also counsel him on maybe trying to avoid a government shutdown? I can't even believe I'm asking you about this with 4 days to go here. But there is a thought, at least among Republicans in the Senate, that he could take some executive actions to try to sort of rein in the activities of ICE that might dislodge enough Democrats to pass the DHS funding bill. Or is this is crazy talk? We're shutting down on Friday night.
Yeah, this is tough. This is really, really tough because I put myself in the seats of the Democrat senators. Not that I'm either of those things. I'm not a Democrat nor a senator, but I've been around the town a little bit. I don't know how they don't take a hard line. It's almost like they were going to sleepwalk into a shutdown because the Democrats don't have a way out. I don't know how they go to their constituents and say, Donald Trump gave us his word that he would make executive changes, so we went ahead and voted for DHS funding. I just don't know if that sells. They want to sell it. I don't think they want to shut down any more than anybody else because they know that once they get into a shutdown, getting out is really hard. And who always loses a shutdown? The side that shuts down to try and get something else, which is what they would be doing here. But honestly, Joe, I don't know how you don't go into shutdown because I just don't think the trust levels are there. If there's any, plus you got a situation we haven't talked about yet, which I'm not sure that if they change anything in the Senate bills, if the House can pass that when they come back. Plus, I don't think the House is going to be there in full force until after Friday anyway. So you put all of that together, put all that math together, and I'm at about 85% on at least a short-term shutdown over the weekend.
Well, that's the conventional wisdom here, Mick. I can't believe everything I'm hearing from you. You're confirming a lot of tough news. Did you hear? 85 seconds to midnight. They reset the doomsday clock. Seems like an appropriate date for it, Mick, right?
There's nothing like a good affirmation in the afternoon, right? That's always, everybody needs that every now and then.
Those weren't the words to the song. Mick, it's great to have you back. Mick Mulvaney with us live on Bloomberg TV and radio. I can't wait to hear what the panel thinks about this, and I'm glad to say that Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us. Fascinating read on Mick Mulvaney. We'll have to get that online. Indeed, by the way, citing a worldwide failure of leadership, the doomsday clock set to 85 seconds to midnight. That happened this morning, the closest it has ever been to catastrophe. Stay with us on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg. Here on Balance of Power, thanks for being with us on the Tuesday edition. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. The president has left us. He's on his way to Des Moines right now. In fact, he's going to be holding forth in Clive, Iowa, the outskirts of Des Moines, where things are pretty chilly today, as you might expect. 16 degrees right now in Des Moines. Of course, we haven't been there since the Iowa caucuses, and this is a state that's been very good to Donald Trump. He's going to be delivering a message on affordability. With our first view of the room there, the president going to be speaking to folks starting in the 4 p.m. hour, right around the closing bell. Gentleman in a New England Patriots sweatshirt holding his spot in the front row about 3 hours ahead of the speech. We'll see if things start on time. The president's going to be making a stop on the way, so we'll let you know if he has any remarks to reporters. He did speak with reporters on the way out of the White House this morning, asking if Alex Preddy's death was justified. He talked about a big investigation, said, I want to see the investigation. I'm going to be watching over it. I want a very honorable and honest investigation. And he was asked about Kristine, whether, in fact, she would step down, as some have suggested, the Homeland Security Secretary. No, was his answer. Not that we know anything about her feelings about the job going forward. The New York Times reporting that she held a 2-hour meeting at her request with Donald Trump in the Oval Office. And now Tom Homan has been dispatched to Minneapolis. He spoke with Governor Tim Walz earlier and will be speaking with Mayor Fry of Minneapolis before the day is out. This is the reset speech, then, we can call it, as we just discussed with Mick Mulvaney. As the president tries to seize on affordability, this is the latest stop on a tour. He was most recently in Detroit trying to deliver a message on the markets, on interest rates. Listen.
In the old days, when you had good numbers, interest rates would go down. When you had good numbers, the market would go through the roof. That's the way we're going to make it again. That's the old-fashioned way. That's the right way. Today, if you announce great numbers, they raise interest rates to try and kill it. So you can never really have the kind of rally you should have. What happens and what we want, we're going to have a lot of great months, a lot of great quarters. I want the market to go up.
Of course, he also wants people to feel it, and that is where the messaging has run into some challenges most recently. We assembled our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne Zaino and Rick Davis are with us. Jeanne is our Democratic analyst and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Rick is our Republican strategist, partner at Stonecourt Capital. If it were your job this time around, Rick, how would you be advising the president to seize this moment and maybe use it a little bit differently? When he went through Pennsylvania, went to Detroit, even in Davos, he spent as much time talking about, in fact, more time, geopolitics and the retribution tour than he did the issue of affordability. What should he do today?
Yeah, in your conversation with Mick Mulvaney, he hit it spot on. He's actually got to talk about the things that this speech is supposed to be about, and that is the challenges, but also the opportunities for the American public to benefit from his economic policies. And look, I mean, he's got a story to tell, and whether it's like what we heard about lower prices or certainly energy prices coming down. And behind that, he's got a little bit of wind at his back with some of the implementation of the One Big Beautiful Bill that'll start occurring now. So child tax credits, go into effect, the Trump accounts, which he's holding a summit on next month. So there are talking points that he should be comfortable with. But if he then falls into the same kind of demagoguery around immigration and, all these countries open their prisons into the United States. I mean, that's just talking past the voter who is looking for news that they could hold on to say this administration's got its act together. And the second thing I would say is he's got to start talking to his voters a little bit. And when he talks about all the markets going up, his voters aren't in the market. I mean, these are, non-college educated, mostly rural, especially male voters who aren't banked into the Wall Street. And so when he talks about making the markets go up, he's making the mistake that the Bidens made, at the time of their election. And that was, talk about the people who are actually hurting, not the ones who are benefiting from the markets.
Jeanne, a week ago at Davos, the president said we have defeated inflation. Will that be his message tonight?
Yeah, that'll be one of his messages. Joe, I'm looking at this picture you were showing of this guy with the Patriots jersey on, and I think Donald Trump should take inspiration from the Patriots last weekend. He's got to pull a rabbit out of the hat to change the messaging here, and he's got to stick to the issue of the economy to do that and affordability. And this is such an important moment. We're seeing it in the polls. I mean, you just look at the latest echelon poll of independents in the generic ballot. Democrats are up 25 points in January. That is a very bad number for Republicans. Just to put that in perspective, last July, Republicans were up +2. You couple that with the fact that Donald Trump in the last week or so has done something that he doesn't usually do, which is back down. We saw it in the case of Greenland, in Davos, as you just mentioned, and now in the last 48 hours on the issue of Minneapolis. He is having a really difficult time. He needs to get back on message. And today, I think, is going to be a moment in front of a friendly Iowan crowd, even though it's freezing cold there, for him to do that. But he's got to be disciplined. And that's always the question with Donald Trump.
Does he speak about immigration this evening? Rick, you mentioned he could, bring out some of the greatest hits that would not resonate with people. But he does have an issue here. Obviously, we've been talking about it for the balance of the hour with what's going on in Minneapolis. Reuters Ipsos is out with new numbers. Americans approve of his handling of immigration, 39%, disapprove 53%. ICE efforts go too far. All adults say, 58%. 92% of Democrats, but 20% of Republicans, and I've got an other at 63% here. Is it just the actions being taken in Minneapolis, or does the message also need to change, Rick?
Well, I think it's all of the above. A year ago, those numbers were upside down, right? Where he was driving his election campaign off the backs of closing the border and being tough on immigration. You can only argue that that's backfired on him, and that whatever he has done in the implementation of that over the last 12 months is actually the wrong direction. And so, normally bells would be going off when you see these numbers in the West Wing of the White House saying, hey, we've got to reset this. And yet they've doubled down. I mean, Minneapolis is a great example of a tone-deaf administration on their signature issue, overplaying their hand and now getting punished for it nationally. If there's another city like Minneapolis between now and Election Day, midterms, forget it. Republicans will have little chance of success. Democrats have already won every statewide election since Donald Trump became president. and by a margin of 14%. And Jeanne just talked about the approval ratings now are, double that for Democrats. I mean, and they haven't done a thing. I mean, like, arguably, their party is just as messed up as the Republican Party, but they're the beneficiary of these stumbles by the administration.
Wow. Something's going to happen while we're talking about economic issues here and interest rates. The president brought it up, Jeanne. Something's going to happen tomorrow. There's going to be the conclusion of a Fed meeting. They're behind closed doors as of today, right? 2-day policy meeting. Right at this time tomorrow, I'm going to be throwing things over to special coverage as we wait for the decision and a news conference from a guy named Jay Powell, who is being investigated, a criminal investigation by the Department of Justice. As soon as the president turns back to the economy, there's something else waiting for him here called the Fed. Is he going to manage this in the days ahead in terms of naming a new Fed chair?
That might be one way for him to turn the page on all of this. And it's funny you mentioned that, Joe. We love a good Fed day. I was just looking back. Senator Kennedy, who says the most colorful things, when they announced that the DOJ was investigating Powell, said, we need this like we need a hole in the head. And that, has got to be tripled now, given what's going on in Minneapolis. So the president, I think today and going forward, has got to show that he can manage both immigration in a sound way and the economy. He's got to talk about his plans that are going to help people on the ground, all of those people Rick talked about that are his supporters and the independents he's losing. And he's got to show that when he turns the page on the Fed and appoints a new Fed chair, it is somebody who has widespread support on Wall Street, on Main Street, and who people trust to do the job. That, I think, would be a great way to start to turn the page on this immigration debacle. But again, Donald Trump is having a really difficult time because he keeps stepping into it. I would just couple that with saying he might need to make some changes at the top with DHS in terms of showing he's serious about getting back on track. But the Fed chair announcement, I think, might be big enough that it could help potentially at least shift some of this focus from immigration.
Would a Fed chair announcement help to buttress his message on affordability? Rick, we're doing everything we can along with this new chair who's going to cut your interest rates.
Well, I wish I could say that it would have an impact because it would certainly play well in Bloomberg. But the reality is nobody outside the Beltway knows or cares about the Fed chair. They care about interest rates. And if the president was able to do something about that, then he would get credit for that. But if you actually took a poll today and asked people to describe the job that Jay Powell has in Washington, you would be not shocked, but hilariously shocked about the selections that they have. I'll bet you a dinner at 801 Chop House, since we're on Iowa today, that nobody knows who the next Fed chair or cares.
I think you and Jeanne already made that bet, but I'll follow up with you on that. And Rick Davis knows how to bring us down to earth here. Back to reality with Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. Great panel. Thank you both for the insights. We'll be very curious to hear from the president. That's, again, 4 p.m. Eastern if he's on time. We'll bring you his remarks here on Bloomberg. Turning our attention next to Iran. This is Balance of Power. We want to stick with the markets for a moment, though, because this is an interesting moment as we dig into the throes of earnings reporting season. And we look at a market here. Look at that, 69.80. S&P 500 is chugging along here, and we could have our 7,000 hats on any moment. And I wonder if it weren't for losses in these insurers, if we might already be there. Wanted to spend some time with Kristine Aquino as we dig a bit deeper on the markets. Bloomberg's managing editor for our Markets Live blog and our good friend at World Headquarters in New York. Kristine, it's great to see you here. United Health, wow, down 20%. This alone is the reason why we've got this big hole in the Dow. It doesn't speak for the broader market today, though, does it?
Yeah, definitely, Joe. I mean, quite the contrast from what we're seeing in the S&P 500. It is all about mega caps. It is all about those big tech names powering those gains. And as you say, we could be wearing our 7,000 hats as soon as this afternoon. I hope you have yours ready.
It's always ready, indeed. My gosh, we're going to be talking Dow 50,000 at some point soon as well. When you remove this United or just the broader insurance story after what the president posted on social media. Where are we here? Have we recovered from this whole Sell America trade? This was a big concern last week. We still haven't seen a Supreme Court ruling on tariffs. We've got a lot of geopolitics giving investors some cross currents. Have we moved beyond that? Is this more of a specific dollar issue as opposed to a Sell America issue?
Yeah, it certainly seems like it's the dollar that's really bearing the brunt of the pain from that Sell America trade. And even as of last week, there was a lot of skepticism over whether, in fact, investors were selling America or maybe just hedging it or pausing their purchases. But, you know, it's really back to the biggest tech stocks this week when it comes to that gain in the S&P 500. And as you know, we're going to get four of the Magnificent Seven reporting tomorrow. And so very interesting setup. A lot of bullishness that kind of carries markets through into those risk events. And of course, before we even hear from four of the Mag 7, we're going to hear from the Federal Reserve. So that's another risk event to factor into.
Okay, let me ask you just quickly on that. Do investors care about the Fed right now, or is it earnings driving this market for better or worse?
I mean, I think the Fed impact is likely going to be longer term, not necessarily about tomorrow's decision, which is scheduled to be unchanged, but yeah, really about the long-term trajectory of the rate path outlook, as well as the future of its independence. I think that's the biggest market concern.
Interesting. We might have to talk again this week, Kristine. Thanks for stopping by, as always. Kristine Aquino, the best of Bloomberg, live from New York. Now, here's a story that no one is talking about, and something tells me that we're about to start talking about it again a lot. The president's going to be back on the Air Force One on his way home from Des Moines tonight, and I suspect he's going to get a couple questions about Iran. He actually did an interview earlier today in which he did bring up the whole armada that he discussed last week, and we're reporting on the terminal now. The Associated Press, Iran-backed militias in Iraq and in Yemen are signaling their willingness to launch new attacks against the aircraft carrier that's just rolling in. We told you, the USS Lincoln Carrier Strike Group making its way to the region, making an attack or strike against Iran possible at any time if that's what the president decides he wants to do. He was on a radio show, as I mentioned earlier today, the Sid and Friends show, in which he talked about the big armada, echoing remarks from just a couple of days ago. Listen.
We're watching Iran. We're watching Iran. You know, we have a lot of ships going that direction, just in case. We have a big flotilla going in that direction. We have an armada. We have a massive fleet heading in that direction, and maybe we won't have to use it. We'll see.
He says even bigger than we had in Venezuela, even though that was the largest aircraft carrier in the world. Pleasure to spend some time on this with Jeanne Gavito, senior advisor with the Cohen Group, former acting principal, deputy assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern Affairs in the Biden administration. Jeanne, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's great to have you. Are we about to strike Iran again? How are you reading this?
I don't know that the president has made a decision yet, and certainly he is hearing a lot of chatter from both camps. There are those like Senator Lindsey Graham who are publicly really urging him on. There are others who I think rightly are questioning what the objective of such a strike would be, and I haven't heard that well answered yet. And then if you look across to the Gulf, I think that, you know, for the most part, the president is hearing from Gulf allies some real skepticism about what a strike would actually contribute to stability in the region.
What would it be attempting to accomplish? A couple of weeks ago, this was about mass protests. The president said, remember, help is on the way. The help never arrived. Thousands of protesters died. So what would this strike do?
So first, I mean, I think we're looking now maybe at tens of thousands of protesters.
Wow.
The loss of life was enormous. And it is quite a dangerous thing.
We're hearing plus 30,000 at this point.
I think it's hard to...
But what would a strike do to save them?
So, I mean, the folks that are encouraging a strike, I think, are really kind of agitating for regime change, and that likely includes Israel as well. I think that perhaps, though, is a false understanding of what the objective is, because you're talking about a millennia-old empire. And so, you know, toppling the top level of leadership doesn't necessarily bring the type of change, I think, that, you know, people are thinking of when they speculate about helping protesters. In fact, you know, every simulation that the U.S. government or military has run in recent years demonstrates that if, in fact, you did take out, for example, the supreme leader, the beneficiary of that would be the IRGC. Hardly a better situation for protesters.
So we would be putting them in control of the country, then is this something that the president needs to tread carefully? Because once we open this can of worms, I'm guessing it wouldn't be like the last set of precision strikes that were targeted directly to nuclear infrastructure, for instance. We'd be going after military installations here, correct?
Certainly military installations, and I think increasingly the messaging that we've heard suggests that we'd be going after the Iranian leadership itself. We know that the Israeli government had advocated for that during the 12-day war. The U.S. actually acted as kind of a break on those ambitions. And so I think you're asking all the right questions about what would be unleashed here. I think it's a correct assumption that we would not simply go in and do kind of a repeat or a mowing of the lawn, as it were, of nuclear facilities.
Yes, right.
And so if we do go after the leadership, I think it's exactly right that we would be opening a can of worms that we are ill prepared to understand.
To what extent do you or the Cohen group or your sources believe that Iran's nuclear program has been reconstituted? Remember the argument about that? The president said decimated, nothing left. We're seeing reports that that's simply not the case, and I wonder if it might become new justification for new strikes.
So again, I think, Israel is moving towards elections this year. There is no secret that Bibi Netanyahu has long advocated for decisive action against Iran. And so if you look forward to Israeli elections, I think that Israel will be agitating for something bigger than what we saw this past summer with the 12-day war. And so a number of justifications come into play, whether it is support of protesters, whether it is ensuring that the nuclear program can't be reconstituted, whether it is talking about the missile program, or as you mentioned in the intro, you have two proxies, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq and the Houthis, who are threatening U.S. interests. All of those give a pretext for a justified strike. And when it comes to the nuclear program, to directly answer that question, I think the statements about it having been decimated were, of course, made before any real assessment of the damage was done. Certainly, the program was put back, but whether or not it was decimated, whether you can unlearn things that you've acquired, knowledge that you've acquired over the years, that is a much different scenario. So I think there are plenty of pretexts for which to strike Iran if, in fact, a decision is made that's the best way forward.
We all remember Signalgate. That was about the U.S. striking this proxy in Yemen. If we're worried about their willingness to launch new attacks against the Lincoln, I guess we didn't quite finish that job. What's the state of
the Houthis continue?
Houthis in Yemen?
Yeah, I mean, the Houthis continue to be, of all of Iran's proxies, which have been degraded over the last year. Certainly, when you're talking about Hezbollah, Hamas, and others.
Could they hit a U.S. carrier strike group? That'd be pretty dramatic.
It would be pretty dramatic, and they certainly have the aspirations. There probably would be a degree of luck involved, but I wouldn't put it out of the question. But the same with Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq. All of these proxy groups possess, some degree of capabilities, certainly backed by Iran, and so I think that is a threat that, first of all, has never really gone away, but that we should take seriously.
We have some headlines just crossing the terminal right now, Jen, that the president spent some time on the phone with the president of Syria. They discussed the transitional phase in Syria, said that the U.S. is ready to back reconstruction in Syria, having welcomed, the president welcoming the ceasefire agreement. Would an attack or a strike against Iran put any of this in jeopardy?
Again, I think that a strike on Iran, one that really was intended to hit at the regime, unleashes some really unpredictable results. And so it would certainly have a destabilizing effect across the region writ large. Specifically, what the impact would be on Syria, I don't know. I think that Syria probably has some risks involved that go beyond Iran at this point. I think the administration has done right in really doubling down on this new al-Shara regime and trying to give him the tools needed to stabilize. But you interject any amount of refugees, economic instability, fluctuating oil prices, there are a lot of shocks that could come from the type of strike that we're talking about.
Just for clarity, by the way, that was from Syrian state media, and we'll let you know if we hear more from President Trump himself about these phone calls. But Jen, I'm curious, what does Saudi Arabia think of this whole conversation we're having, and are they in the president's ear?
MBS is certainly in the president's ear, and I think when it comes to this conversation, that's probably a positive thing. As the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris have been telling us for years, they are, of course, the closest neighbors to Iran, and so therefore have the most to lose. There was a period of time where those countries really were in the crossfires. In recent years, Saudi Arabia in particular has really taken steps to try to normalize its relationship with Iran and inject a degree of stability into it. And so for Saudi Arabia, which of course has significant strategic ambitions, a renewed conflict in the region, again, the likes of which we can't entirely understand, would serve as a real disincentive to the type of investment that they're seeking at the moment. So yes, I think MBS is absolutely in the president's ear. We know that Qatar and Saudi Arabia in particular have been advising against this type of strike. It's a little bit less clear what the UAE has been saying. I think all of those countries have a wariness about Iran that is well justified, but that has to be balanced against the instability that would result.
I've only got about a minute left. Jen, I don't want to set you up here with an unanswerable question, but could we be in a world in which the president's board of peace, including a board member named Benjamin Netanyahu, helps to settle what's about to happen in Iran?
Absolutely. I mean, if you're talking militarily, that is absolutely.
What would Iran's neighbors think of that?
Well, I mean, we know to some degree, and we saw that play out this summer. We've already heard, again, from the Gulf states, their unwillingness to open their airspace for these types of attacks. There is a real sensitivity, more so since Gaza, but not only. There's a real sensitivity to the appearance that they are in some way collaborating with Israel, with Iran. With Israel, in order to attack a regional neighbor. And so that is certainly an unpredictable element as well.
You're one of the first calls we'll make if this happens one way or the other. We'd love to know. Jeanne Gavito, thank you so much. The Cohen Group, it's always a pleasure to spend some time with you, and we appreciate the insights here on Bloomberg. I'll meet you back here on the late edition. President will likely be speaking in Des Moines. That starts 5 p.m. Eastern Time right here on Bloomberg.